Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Year in Review, and the third of our four-part look at the big stories, the highs and lows and the personalities at Westminster in 1999. Coming up in the next half hour, international affairs through the Westminster Looking Glass. Britain at war for 75 days in the Balkans in aid of the Kosovo Albanians. It was condemned by the Labour left and some on the Tory right. Anti-China protests. Did government ministers conspire with the police to suppress demonstrations against President Jiang Zemin? And Lady Thatcher breaks a 3-year silence to come to the aid of the former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. But we begin with Kosovo, where ethnic cleansing turned to genocide and MPs had to grapple with the reality of Britain at war over Yugoslavia. The gathering crisis in Kosovo was already weighing heavily on the minds of MPs as the year began, with mounting outrage over the actions of the Serb military and growing demands for Britain to join in military action to save the Kosovo Albanians. After months of argument and negotiation, the launch of NATO airstrikes was announced in an emergency late-night statement by the Deputy Prime Minister.
The NATO military action, which has the full support of all the 19 member states, is intended to support the political aims of the international community. It is justified as an exceptional measure to prevent an overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe. It is and will continue to be directed towards disrupting the violent attacks being committed by the Yugoslav army and the Serbian Special Police Force and weakening their ability to continue their repressive strategy.
The opposition front bench gave its full backing to the government's approach, but there was forthright opposition from the veteran Labour MP, Tony Benn.
People perhaps of my generation who lived through the 30s and the 40s feel a sense of utter shame and disgust that the British government should be breaking its solemn commitments to the United Nations and launch air attacks upon Serbia, which, if he recalls it, was praised to the skies during the war because it was the Serbian resistance to Hitler that gave us the opportunity of the victory which we secured. And to demonize Serbia now, when Yugoslavia was deliberately broken up by Western policymakers, is to mislead the public into a crusade that does not exist.
And opposition too from the right-wing Tory, the former Defence Minister Alan Clark, making one of his final speeches in the House before his death in the summer.
This war is clumsy, wasteful and shambolic. I accept that the intentions of many of those who've signed up to it are honourable, but I can see neither clearly defined objectives nor any measurable progress in attaining them. And our own Prime Minister appears to be making things up as he goes along.
The Liberal Democrats criticised the government for ruling out the use of ground troops. They urged ministers to make contingency plans.
Unless we are prepared soon to take a decision on the reinforcement of those troops against a contingency that we might have to use them on the ground against whatever kind of opposition, then the moment may have arrived when we have left it too late. It would be surely a disaster if NATO was to achieve its air aims and give us an opportunity to use ground troops, but we hadn't taken a decision early enough. Would that not be then snatching defeat from the jaws of victory?
In the event, ground troops did not have to fight their way into Kosovo, and after 75 days came the news of the final breakthrough.
Madam Speaker, I come to the House tonight with some important and welcome news about the situation in Kosovo. At the end of many long hours, hard hours of discussion and negotiation, General Sir Michael Jackson has announced that he has signed the military technical agreement on behalf of NATO, which sets out the detailed conditions for peace.
By common consent, George Robertson had what was described as a good war. Within months, he was made a life peer and appointed to the new Secretary-Generalship of NATO. But if things were going well for the Defence Ministry, the Foreign Office did not have such an easy ride in 1999. They buried the hatchet with Libya, but faced real difficulties where China, Chile and West Africa were concerned. Fighting in Sierra Leone was high on the political agenda for months, as MPs argued over the so-called Arms to Africa affair and allegations that the Foreign Office had given the nod to the British firm Sandline to breach an international arms embargo. An inquiry by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee rejected the claim, but its report was dynamite, accusing government officials of appalling failures and of keeping ministers in the dark.
Isn't it actually a story of incompetence and half-truths and secrecy and contempt for Parliament, for which the Foreign Secretary is responsible, for which the Prime Minister is responsible? It's not a happy situation for the world's top moral and spiritual leader to be presiding over that.
Well, Madam Speaker, I simply emphasise yet again that actually they did not find that ministers had engaged in some great conspiracy to breach arms embargoes. They did not find any of the allegations made by the opposition correct. They did launch very serious, indeed vehement criticisms about the behaviour of certain civil servants. I happen to think those criticisms are unfair.
The Labour MP Ernie Ross was suspended from the Commons after admitting that he leaked a copy of the committee's report to the Foreign Secretary before publication.
The committee concluded that my action as a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in making available to the Foreign Office a draft of the committee report was a serious interference with the Select Committee system, and my conduct fell below the standards that the House is entitled to expect from its members. Madam Speaker, I believe that all members of this House should accept reports of the House that are critical of them, and of course I do so. I would therefore wish to apologise to the House for my actions in this matter. With your permission, Madam Speaker, I now wish to withdraw from the House.
The state visit to Britain by China's President Jiang Zemin caused a controversy over the way in which the police handled pro-Tibet and human rights demonstrators who pursued the president throughout his trip. The police were accused of acting in a heavy-handed manner, and there were claims that Scotland Yard had, in fact, been acting on the orders of the government.
The Foreign Secretary, I believe, and his officials conspired with the Chinese to prevent lawful demonstrations by human rights activists. I don't suppose that he's going to make a video about that. And what we see here is the self-styled champion of global human rights exposed as a fraud, a mouse that cannot even squeak, let alone roar, when the Chinese are the audience.
There was absolutely no collusion at all between our department and the police. There were no meetings with ministers and the police, and the Chinese were informed that there would be demonstrations, as usual, in this country, freely respected, and will he also confirm, no one was arrested, no one was charged or countercharged, no one has actually reported the fact that they were arrested or charged as a result of that visit. What's the difference from the way that his department, when he was a minister, carried out state visits, except the fact that he himself took no action at all?
Well, my God, have we touched a raw nerve, Mr. Deputy Speaker?
Well, with me here in Downing Street is the BBC's diplomatic correspondent, Bridget Kendall. Bridget, very odd scenes with the visit of the Chinese here. What's your take on that?
Well, I know that Foreign Office officials always thought that the state visit of the Chinese president would be trouble. There had been the whole year dominated by Kosovo, the British government prepared with NATO to go and intervene in another country for the sake of the humanitarian suffering of other people. And here was a visit by a Chinese president, enormous criticism of China by Amnesty and other human rights organisations because of their human rights records, and they knew that there'd be protesters on the streets, and they knew that this discrepancy in their foreign policy was bound to be shown up.
Tony Blair in the House of Commons, actually before the crisis really developed, was constantly sort of dropping hints about whether or not we were going to go into Kosovo and what was happening. Did they know what was going on then, or were they making it up as they went along?
Well, you'd hear officials and politicians talk about how there was a need to wrap Milosevic on the wrist. And I think that's what they thought they were going to do. I think many people didn't expect the people of Yugoslavia, the Serbs who were in Yugoslavia, to rally around their government in the way they did. And actually, when it came to it, I don't think anyone quite understood why in the end he did capitulate. And the point of this policy, certainly as far as the Americans were concerned, but I think the other main NATO allies too, was to get rid of the problem of Milosevic, to make Yugoslavia a normal country again. And to that extent, of course, the Kosovo conflict hasn't yet worked.
Reflect, if you would, on the difference between what was happening in Kosovo earlier on this year and what's happening in Chechnya now.
It's interesting that during the last Chechnya war, if you ask experts, they will agree, there was even less feeling by the West that they ought to intervene to stop the Russians in what they were doing, and after all, what was their own sovereign territory, than there is this time. And yet, our politicians here in other Western countries are being criticised by the public far more this time round for not doing enough. And that is, of course, because Kosovo has happened in between. And people say, well, if you can go in to help the refugees in Kosovo, intervene in the sovereign affairs of Yugoslavia, why isn't it all right to do it with Russia? Is it again because, like China, it's an enormous state and you don't defend it? And of course there is something in that. There's the added question that this government, and particularly the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, has made much of having an ethical foreign policy. And if you have an ethical foreign policy, surely you care about human rights. We did in East Timor, didn't we? We intervened there to help the people of East Timor when the Indonesian soldiers went in and were clearly carrying out a massacre. So why suddenly have we stopped short with Chechnya? And it's this difficulty in an enormous and complex world where you have to balance moral questions against trade options and the strategic interests and economic interests of your own country, especially when you're competing with your allies in Europe and the United States, that makes the whole question of Chechnya and these other questions difficult to fit into one clear pattern of ethical foreign policy.
Bridget Kendall talking to me earlier in Downing Street. Well, one of the more bizarre foreign affairs stories this year concerned the Chilean dictator, General Augusto Pinochet. Remember the rented house in Surrey? Yes. The case of General Pinochet continued to produce harsh political exchanges, provoking the former Prime Minister, Lady Thatcher, to make her first speech in the House of Lords for 3 years. General Pinochet flew into London in September 1998 for medical treatment and was arrested at a private clinic to face extradition proceedings brought by Spain on charges of torture. Lady Thatcher visited the General at his rented home in Surrey and then, on July the 6th, launched a savage attack on the British government's handling of the affair.
Senator Pinochet is, of course, being victimised because the organised international left are bent on revenge. But on his fate depends much else besides. Henceforth, all former heads of government are potentially at risk. Those still in government will be inhibited from taking the right action in a crisis because they may later appear before a foreign court to answer for it. And in the final, I am nearly at the end.
If the noble lady would be kind enough to give way, this is a time-limited debate. The limit is 4 minutes, and the noble lady is now in her 7th minute. I wonder if she could now bring her remarks to a close.
I am very close to the end, and I very rarely take up the time of this House. Now, you're going to make me take longer because noble Lord interrupted me in the middle of a sentence. Because henceforth, all former heads of government are potentially at risk. Those still in government will be inhibited from taking the right action in a crisis because they may later appear before a foreign court to answer for it. And where I was when I was interrupted, in a final ironic twist, those who do wield absolute power in their countries are highly unlikely now to relinquish it for fear of ending their days in a Spanish prison. My lords, this is the Pandora's box which has been opened, and unless Senator Pinochet returns safely to Chile, there will be no hope of closing it.
In October, Lady Thatcher returned to the attack, this time at the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool. Are you disrupting this conference by concentrating so much on General Pinochet?
Is that the best question you can ask? You poor thing.
A spin-off from the Pinochet affair came when Tories began asking the questions. Why is an 84-year-old ex-dictator being prosecuted, they wanted to know, when it appears that an 87-year-old grandma who spied for the Soviet Union for 40 years is getting away with it? Melita Norwood was exposed as the spy who came in from the Co-op in September, and told reporters she had no regrets and would probably do it all over again. The official position is that the case is still open and that she could still be prosecuted.
In the light of Mrs. Norwood's recent statements, the papers in this case are currently being studied again by the prosecuting authorities. I also understand that 4 other cases covering the Metrokin archive and related matters are also being considered.
Ms. Anne Widdicombe.
A move welcomed by the opposition.
Can he explain how the decision not to prosecute so far squares with the decision to prosecute Shayla, and what is the comparable basis? Can he also confirm that age was not a factor in deciding whether or not to prosecute Mrs. Norwood, since that would stack up rather oddly with his decisions in the case of General Pinochet?
The Lib Dems said there was widespread revulsion about people who spied against Britain in the past.
That doesn't mean to say that we as a country should have a policy that we prosecute everybody who spied, no matter how long ago it happened, the seriousness of what they did, or above all the public interest in whether a prosecution should go ahead.
Well, with me now are the former Conservative Home Secretary Michael Howard, the Liberal Democrat MP Simon Hughes, who we've just seen in action, and the veteran Labour MP Tony Benn, who's standing down at the next election. Let's start by talking about Kosovo, if we could, because an awful lot of the government's foreign policy has centred around the whole Kosovo issue. Tony Benn, was the government right in taking the action that they did in retrospect?
It was a breach of the United Nations Charter, which says only the Security Council can authorise. It was a breach of the NATO treaty, which commits NATO to the UN Charter. It was planned ages ago. The so-called Rambouillet Accord was an ultimatum to Milosevic. And, of course, now the war is over and terrible damage is done. We're leaving Serbia in terrible poverty. And the Albanian Kosovars are now ethnically cleansing the Serbs. So I think it was wrong. And it's interesting to me the coverage of the Kosovo war compared to the coverage by the BBC, for example, of the Chechnya war, although actually very, very similar.
We'll come on to Chechnya in a second. What would you have done instead?
Well, I mean, if you look at the facts, the fact is that Milosevic agreed to inspectors there, and provided they weren't NATO troops. I mean, he agreed to it all. That was never made clear in the House of Commons, but the Serbian Parliament and Milosevic said, if you want to leave the OSCE inspectors there to check this, and Lord Carrington, after all, who was the former Secretary General of NATO, said that the mass ethnic cleansing began after the bombing began. Terrible things had been done before, but nothing like on the scale that's occurred since on both sides. So I think it was a tragedy. I think it was an error. And, of course, the Danube was blocked, and the government won't do anything to help to build up the damage done that's inflicted damage on innocent people in Serbia.
Michael Howard.
I think even in retrospect, the action was justified. I supported it at the time, although I did ask a lot of quite critical questions about some aspects of the operation. And I don't resile from that. I haven't changed my mind. I don't think that the aftermath was properly thought through. I don't think there was a proper plan thought through for what to do afterwards. And as we now know, a lot of what we were told about the damage that was being done to Serb military installations was grotesquely exaggerated. But nevertheless, I think that there would have been mass ethnic cleansing if the bombing had not taken place. And I think it was right to intervene. The fundamental objective was to return the Kosovars to their homes. And that has actually been achieved, though not in ideal circumstances and not in the circumstances I would have liked.
You were right in the thick of things. Were you surprised, as many of us were, by the speed with which Milosevic somehow capitulated? It all seemed to suddenly happen very, very quickly, and people were still saying, we'll have to send ground troops in, this war's going to have to escalate, and suddenly, bang, it was over.
It was quite surprising, and I mean, nobody still knows quite why it ended as it did. Lots of people who say it was all due to Russian intervention and what they said to Milosevic. I don't know the truth about that, but yes, I was surprised.
Simon Hughes, your party was quite bullish during all the debates that we saw, endless late-night debates about Kosovo. How does that play now with your conscience? I mean, the party was, Paddy Ashton was one of the people saying, hang on a second, what about ground troops, what about ground troops? And ping, it was all over.
Well, Paddy was the leader throughout both the Iraq-Kuwait period and throughout the Balkan troubles. And Paddy would take a strategic military political view and would help us, to be honest. Now, some people struggle more with the consequences of that than others. There were certainly issues about the international legality, which we questioned. I have to say, it is never very clear where legality ends and illegality begins. And some of us were troubled about the decision, but we're in a world where recognition of old sovereignties doesn't happen anymore. And I share Michael's view that, on balance, and I came to that view personally, that I could accept that we needed to act. I think we acted too late. I think the whole of the history of this decade was that by the recognition of Germany, by Germany and by us, of the first separatist country from the former Yugoslavia, instead of asking for a peace conference then, to be honest, we condemned the Balkans, we, the international community, to 6 or 7 years of civil wars, one after the other, which might have been able to be avoided. But the conclusion is that we are now wrestling with a huge reconstruction job where I don't think we're paying enough attention, though we ought to. And I fear we became over anti-Slav and over anti-Serb, and the Russians were always going to be needed, and the other Slav nations always going to be needed to be able to get Milosevic and his people to participate in talks.
This is all about the ethical foreign policy that this government is supposed to support. What conclusions do you draw that we haven't started bombing the Russians because over Chechnya?
I think that it's still a bit of a pick-and-mix foreign policy, to be honest, and I think that it's very easy to say you're in favour of an ethical foreign policy. It is much more difficult to deliver. The truth of the matter is we're still driven by British interests. That's the truth of the matter.
Tony Benn.
Well, when you think that we supplied weapons, both governments did, to Indonesia right up to the end. 200,000 people in East Timor were killed, and we supplied weapons. And when the Indonesian government couldn't afford them, we gave them the Hawk bombers. Cost us 130 million quid, which is exactly what we take off students every year in tuition fees. You know, I mean, when you think of it like that. And similarly, in Iraq, between 4,000 and 5,000 children under 5 are dying every month because of the sanctions. That's Dennis Halliday, the head of the Oil for Food Programme, an Irish Quaker, Assistant General Secretary of the UN. I don't think we're following an ethical foreign policy at all.
Michael Howard, do you feel like defending Robin Cook here and saying, hang on a second, there is a certain amount of pragmatism that needs to be built into our foreign policy?
I certainly don't feel like defending Robin Cook. And, I mean, if just to hark back to Kosovo for a moment, the lead-up to the intervention in Kosovo was an absolute model of how diplomacy should not be conducted, with endless threats, repeats of threats, and no action taken.
But we have to be pragmatic, don't we?
Well, the point is this. Every British government has conducted an ethical foreign policy in the sense that every foreign secretary has tried to take into account ethical considerations in what he did. And the previous Conservative government, for example, did refuse to sell certain arms to Indonesia. What Robin Cook did, his great mistake, was by making such a song and a dance about things, he raised expectations sky high. He was never going to be able to deliver those expectations, and he's got the worst of all worlds. And if you want to encapsulate in one example the extent to which he fell short of those expectations, this government is the first British government for 10 years not to condemn China's human rights policy at the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. We did it every year, and the present government hasn't done it once. I think that is absolutely disgraceful.
Let's come on to China. We're in the privileged position of having you here because you're a former Foreign Affairs spokesman, former Home Secretary. The way the whole Chinese visit was handled, as a former Home Secretary, do you believe that the Metropolitan Police were instructed to suppress demonstrations by the government?
Well, we know there were meetings between the Metropolitan Police and government officials, and my strong impression, and I've talked to some onlookers who had no vested interest from either side, is that this visit was policed in a very different way from other state visits. And I think that it was extraordinary. I mean, I have the greatest respect for the Metropolitan Police, but I think the way in which people were pushed to the ground, had banners taken out of their hands, that's not the way in which we have traditionally policed demonstrations in this country.
Simon Hughes, do you agree with Michael Howard that the government should have been openly and outwardly criticising Chinese policy as far as Tibet, etc. is concerned?
With respect, it wasn't even the issue. It wasn't the government that needed to be doing that. It was people who had supported Tibet, who had been here when the Dalai Lama had been on his visit just some months before, who wanted to express their opinion. And at the end of the day, and I think it changed midweek, interestingly, as a result of the protests and the pictures on the television, the impression had been given that the government were concerned that the reputation of and the impression given to the Chinese head of state should not be interfered with by protesters. And the reality is that the Home Secretary has a very difficult line in Britain, but you have to keep law and order and defend civil liberty. And it was very clear that the impression was given that the civil liberties of the protester were not being defended as much as the forces of law and order.
Call a spade a spade. Look at Tiananmen Square, terrible. Look at Seattle. I mean, really, I wondered whether the next time an American comes to Britain, you ought not to protest about the policing of the Seattle things. Glenys Kinnock said the police overreacted. No, what I think sticks in my gullet more than anything else is the hypocrisy of many of the comments. Because, of course, the Chinese have repressed people in Tiananmen Square. But, I mean, the whole history of the British Empire was we did it, and we always did it in a humanitarian way. We always said it was about humanitarian motives.
Does an ethical foreign policy stretch to sending General Pinochet off to be tried?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the Pinochet case is instead of taking sanctions against nations where innocent people suffer, which I think sanctions of the kind now applied are themselves a crime against humanity, you pick an individual who's responsible, you bring him before an international court. Now, I know it's pioneering, and maybe we don't know how it'll end up. And Pinochet, in a sense, has already been tried because he was held here. But I do think it'd be better, if you want to establish a principle of international law, that you go for the people you can identify as with the War Crimes Tribunal after the war, rather than punish a nation for what has been done by their leaders, what we did in Iraq.
So you're in favour of sending Pinochet off for trial in Spain, then?
Well, I mean, it's the court has said that he should go. Well, the court has said there's no obstacle, and the Home Secretary
can go.
Well, I know, but if the Home Secretary were to...
This is a crucial distinction, because Jack Straw and every other government minister keep saying this is a matter where the law's got to take its course as though it's nothing to do with them. That is completely misleading. The Home Secretary has a very wide discretion. He could have said at the beginning, and in my view he should have said at the beginning, we've invited General Pinochet into this country, we've given him VIP treatment, it would be quite wrong for us to take this action. Chile has been through a very difficult time. Chile wants to deal with these problems itself. Chile should be allowed to deal with these problems itself.
Does this prosecution extend to prosecuting spies who are admitted to spying, like Melita Norwood in this country, 87 years old?
It's a different issue.
It's a similar issue.
It's a different issue because Melita Norwood is a British citizen, and we're talking about dealing with her here. Tony Benn raised the rightful agenda of the International Criminal Court, and the sooner we get to a series of mechanisms whereby you have an International Criminal Court, whereby decision-making about international action is taken collectively, and where governments do have to come to Parliament to get approval for example, arms licenses, the better. The spy case, my view is you take a balance of judgment, a public interest decision, and it probably is not in the public interest that we spend a lot of time chasing an 87-year-old. We concentrate more on the agenda of tomorrow than the agenda of 50 years ago.
Did you know about the likes of Melita Norwood when you were in the Cabinet, when you were Home Secretary?
I didn't know anything about Melita Norwood.
OK. Let's leave it there. Thanks very much indeed to Tony Benn, Michael Howard and Simon Hughes. In our final programme, we'll be looking at some of the most dramatic moments at Westminster, the day John Prescott got his questions muddled up and had great difficulty in finding the answer. William Hague's finest hour, the joke that brought the House down until it all went pear-shaped for the Tories. And the Chancellor, who's been cutting taxes or raising taxes, depending on your point of view, and who opinion polls say is more popular than Tony Blair. From all of us here at Westminster, goodbye for now.